no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
Will is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is Will Communications Director Pat Garrett, and joining me back again as always is Will President and Founder Rick Esenberg for another great episode of our podcast. So today we're actually going to talk a little bit about America's classrooms. I think what's happening in education, whether it's in Wisconsin or beyond, is really going to shape the future of our country. And so joining us as our guest is Will Flanders, PhD research director here at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Will is a leading expert on education policy, and he's the architect behind a ton of our policy work and impactful reports we put out on school choice and academic performance. He specializes in using data-driven research to peel back the curtain on how our schools are actually performing and what it will take to get students back on track, again, here in Wisconsin and across America. So we're going to dive into this education topic today. And just to make it easier, you might hear us call Will Flanders Flanders. It's what we call him now. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into this episode. And we appreciate everyone being here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
One of the things I wanted to do to make this about the Constitution, I thought, let's go back to what the founding fathers have said about education. So I pulled this quote from James Madison, which I thought was great. It reads, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." Again, that was by James Madison. So, Flanders, I'll kick this over to you. Do you think we're doing that?
I think we're failing to live up to what Madison sort of was looking for in that regard, and particularly we've seen a decline in educational outcomes since the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you look at any number of metrics, what we've seen is that we sort of peaked in terms of our proficiency on things like the NAEP, which is the National Assessment for Educational Progress, around 2015. And particularly since the pandemic, we've been in something of a decline. You can look nationally, you can also look internationally, where the United States sort of stagnates in the bottom half of nations around the world, at least among industrialized nations, in terms of student outcomes. So I think we're failing pretty strongly in that regard, and unfortunately, in recent years, it's only gotten worse.
I agree with you. I think we've really lost our way when it comes to education in America. I think it's disappointing, it's scary, and Rick, I was curious what your assessment is of the state of education today.
I mean, I agree with Flanders. The problem here is that over a fairly long period of time, Will correct me if I'm wrong, we have increased our spending on K-12 education. As a general rule, we spend much more than other developed countries do on a per pupil basis. And yet, educational attainment has either been flat or declining. And when I say a long period of time, I'm talking about 50, 60 years. And I don't think that there's any one reason for this. There's rarely just one reason for anything. But I think one of the problems is that the system has increasingly become run and managed for the people who work in it. I remember, back when I was in high school, and that was a long time ago. My favorite teacher, who was a history teacher, shocked me by saying that he opposed the unionization of teachers. And I, of course, was, kind of a left-leaning 16-year-old at the time. And I said, well, why would that be? Why would you possibly oppose that? And he said, because I am a professional. And a professional puts people that he or she serves ahead of his or her own personal interests. And I think he was, at the time, I thought that he was being silly. And looking back at it and seeing what's happened in all that time, I think he was prescient.
You're a 16-year-old leftist. I didn't know that.
Kind of, yeah. I have to admit that I was.
So, I
It's the old saying, Pat, that he who is not a socialist at 20 has no heart, and he who is not a conservative at 40 has no brain.
I assume Flanders and I have no hearts. Then that's probably what it is. So
Well, you're closer to 40 than you are to 16.
that's true. That's true. Now, very true. So one of the things I think we talk about is like this need for more money, but there are new challenges facing schools today, like technology and all that. I mean, like we need money, right? Because like, and also just inflation, and teachers need to get paid a wage to be competitive, or we do have a teacher shortage. I mean, Flanders, like, what do you think? Like, do you think that of course, like the increase in money, some of it's justified, but where do we draw the line?
Yeah, so I think there are things that have, certainly raised costs. You mentioned technology. I think what we've seen, in the last few years, actually, is we've gone too far in the direction of technology. We can, maybe discuss that a bit later, in terms of the need to provide one-to-one technology for every student when there's little evidence that that's doing anything to improve student outcomes, and they're, it's not necessarily even increasing student proficiency with using the important tech, like managing Excel documents, managing Word documents, managing databases. Those aren't the kind of things that are happening with the sort of iPads and things like that as well. But in terms of spending, in Wisconsin, we're up to $18,592 per student, and even adjusted for inflation, we're spending $2,000 or $3,000 more dollars than we were in the year 2000. We've seen increases in technology, but we've also seen increases in schools implementing layer upon layer of educational bureaucracy, people that don't impact students on a daily basis. So, while there are some things that have become more expensive, I'd argue there's a lot of excess that's been built into the system over the last 20 to 30 years, that there is room for some reductions in, while we still recognize the need to sort of keep up and make sure we're spending where money is actually needed.
Do you even know off the top of your head what the average class size in Wisconsin is? Class size in Wisconsin? Because I'm just thinking like 18,000 times what, 25 students? I mean, that's an astronomical amount per classroom.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're a little bit lower, actually. We're in about 18 kids per classroom, but we're talking about $300,000 of value in every classroom. And we talk about the need to pay teachers more, right? Instead of asking school districts for even more money, we've often said teachers ought to be asking their school districts, where's all that money going that's not going into my pocket? Because there's a lot of, again, layer upon layer of excess that doesn't affect directly the classrooms in many instances.
I've always thought that part of the problem is that teachers have adopted sort of industrial union view of what their position is, right? It's kind of a Lake Wobegon view of teachers, if listeners will understand that now increasingly old reference. They think everyone is above average. And the fact of the matter is, it's simply not the case. And there are fantastic teachers who are probably underpaid under the current system. They should be getting a lot more. I mean, if you are a really, really effective teacher, and particularly you're effective at teaching students with difficult home circumstances, it's worth a lot of money, right? You should get paid more than the others. On the other hand, we ought not to protect those teachers who, simply aren't doing the job and who would benefit from an opportunity to succeed elsewhere.
I would say the education system is set up in a way that's in a way anti the American system of government in a lot of ways. Like we just talked about, it's not a merit-based system. It doesn't reward innovation. It doesn't reward harder work or going above and beyond, right? And so maybe my question then is, what does that mean for what kind of kids are we producing in a system that doesn't reward merit? Do we think that this system of, the teachers unionization, is that going to play out in the classroom where we're going to, teach kids not to innovate, not to go above and beyond?
Yeah, I think that's right. The industrial sort of system of education is what we've modeled in this country, really going back to the 1800s when we had sort of mass public education. There's a lot of great history there about that. But I think what we've seen recently, or not necessarily recently, but it seems to have gotten worse in recent years, is that from kindergarten through the college degree, we're setting up a system that's really just incentivizing passing kids through. So, we've seen since COVID a decline in student proficiency, But what we've not seen is a decline in graduation rates. We've seen high schools become increasingly a rubber stamp where students can be passed through the system whether they've learned any of the material or not. We see school districts implementing these things like credit recovery. There was a teacher who went viral a few weeks ago for discussing how a student who hadn't shown up in high school the entire semester comes on the last week of school and says, what can I do to pass? And the school system isn't saying, you might be needing to retake this grade. The school system is telling this teacher, you need to work with them to make sure they actually pass. And so they put this kid into a credit recovery system. They can take this test over and over again with multiple choice questions, be given the credit for passing the class, even though they didn't absorb much of the material, the entire semester. Then we get to the college level. We have remedial classes that sort of are reteaching what kids were supposed to learn in high school. The vast majority of schools have a number of students, at least in Wisconsin, the vast majority of high schools have kids going to college that are having to take these remedial classes. And then we're sort of pushing kids through the college degree as well. So we've disincentivized, making sure that kids have learned anything along the way, and incentivized just getting those pieces of paper, the high school or the college diploma. The problem with that is the more we do that, the more useless those pieces of paper become in terms of a signal about what kids have actually been taught.
What would you say, with declining academic scores and stuff, like what would you say to teachers who say we shouldn't even worry about tests? We shouldn't be teaching to a test. We shouldn't worry about test scores. We don't need any of that. And so that's not a valuable metric for assessing our state of education.
Yes, I think increasingly the opposite is true. Testing and standardized testing is really the only objective metric that we have to see where students are. We've heard things about the ACT actually being made easier, right? They've reduced some of the standards on the ACT for a perfect score as well. But it really is the only thing across the board, given that we have schools that are no longer giving grades lower than 50. We have school districts that aren't even using an A to F grading scale. The ACT, SAT are really the only objective metrics out there we have for how well students are doing. So I think if anything, they're more important than they've been before.
One of the things I do want to touch on as well is like this concept that private businesses, like any sort of corporation or things like that, like they would expect to see, return on investment after kind of running the same model after 20 years. They were 10 years or 5 years. They don't see that model. They don't see that change. They're going to adjust their model. They're going to adjust their battle plan, right? Like that's, whether it's for a profit to stay open or for stockholders or whatever. I just feel like that accountability doesn't exist right now with education. And so then, and I think parents are upset. I think some teachers are upset, right? I don't think there's any sort of way to hold education accountable to a new standard, like even whether we keep the test scores or not. So, Flanders, like talk about what we could be doing to hold, public schools accountable to the job they need to do.
Yes, there's a lot of different, sort of ideas there. Some of them I'll just start off by saying, offering more school choice options are one of the key ways that we can introduce accountability to the system. What we've seen here in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, we have the oldest private school choice program in the country in Milwaukee, and then expansion statewide in the 2010s, is that it's a slow process, but families do gravitate towards those schools that are providing something better in a number of different metrics. That metric could be better success on tests and higher proficiency. Sometimes in a city like Milwaukee, that metric is something as simple as providing a safe environment for learning to happen. That's sort of a preeminent, right, for even learning to take place, is that the environment be safe. And school choice, does provide an incentive, because if public schools are losing students to schools that are offering these alternatives, they have an incentive to try to improve. It's probably been a much slower process than we'd like to see. But we do see evidence over time of that happening, both in Milwaukee, and there was a good study in Florida in recent months that showed us similar results. So, school choice is a key option. I think a carrot and sticks approach to some extent for public school spending also ought to be on the table. So I think if schools are doing a good job, they ought to be rewarded with more funding, and there ought to be some, not obviously taking away a huge amount of the per pupil spend in low performing districts, but there ought to be some sort of an incentive and maybe disincentive for poor performance over time. I think the last thing I'll mention here is that there's an informational problem. Busy parents, particularly low income parents, but parents across the spectrum, don't necessarily have time to go look up state report cards to understand the nuances of how we grade schools, around the state or around the country. So ways that we can get that information into parents' hands more effectively is something that ought to be looked at, because only if parents have the information can they realize that maybe their local public school isn't doing as great a job as they're sort of hearing in the media.
I think school choice is an easy one. I think Rick would agree that, when we bring school choice in, we're giving parents options. Parents in a lot of ways can vote with their feet. We see that, right? And maybe Flanders, before I ask Rick a question, could you kind of show to us what we see as far as like maybe declining enrollment among public schools and a rise in enrollment in private schools? Or do we see that?
Yeah, so I did a study 3 or 4 years ago with Corey DeAngelis that was actually made it to an academic journal, so a peer-reviewed study that essentially showed that was the case, that the schools that are growing in the school choice program over time were those that had higher test scores, and that parents, or excuse me, kids to some extent were leaving those low-performing public schools. So as you say, we do see the evidence that families are voting with their feet. And, in Milwaukee, we've seen a huge decline in public school enrollment over the last 20 years. And, to some extent, that's a product of, population changes that I think we may discuss even further as well. But to some extent, that is the choice in charter sectors as seen by folks as offering better options. So those sectors have grown pretty extensively, while public school population has declined over time. And I think that's pretty good evidence that there is some voting with their feet going on.
Well, I'm so fascinated by this too, because obviously the left's response to this is to like get rid of private schools and like stop the vouchers and like don't, basically deny parents this opportunity because they think it makes the public schools even worse, I think is one way. They literally think it like starves them of funding. Maybe why is that not a fair assessment?
The attitude is, particularly in Milwaukee, this is true towards school funding, is that, if a student is no longer being educated by the system, then the school no longer ought to be receiving funding for that student, right? Just as if I am shopping at Kroger and switch to Walmart or vice versa, the other grocery store is no longer going to be receiving the funding I used to be spending there. So what we want to see is more of a market system in education where money follows the kid no matter which school door they go through. And to say that somehow a system that's ineffective for families that parents are desirous of leaving ought to be rewarded with continued, stagnant or growing funding as kids leave the system, I think is sort of antithetical to what we understand about the market in any other context.
I mean, isn't that assertion belied by the numbers? I mean, if in fact the average spending per pupil in public schools has gone up, then that would suggest that the choice schools have not robbed them of any funding.
Sure.
I understand that it's difficult to adjust to change. And so if you lose students to choice schools, you have to do some painful things, right? You may have to close buildings. You have to reduce your fixed costs because you are now a smaller school district. And that's a problem because what school districts have, I think public school districts have tried to make a lot of, cosmetic changes or changes that are consistent with the interest of the people who work for the district. So, they'll impose a uniform policy or they'll do something like that. But things that cause pain, right? Things that cause change that will impact people who work there, that run contrary to the interests of the educational establishment, are the things that they have the most trouble getting done.
One of the things that I think we've talked a little bit about in the media coverage after some of these referendums haven't, we were talking about schools maybe closing or dissolving or combining and consolidation. Is that inevitable? Is school district consolidation inevitable? And I think Flanders, why don't you give us the numbers first, and Rick we'll talk about it.
Yeah, so I think the vast majority of states around the country are facing the declining enrollment situation. We're expecting an over 4% decline in enrollment in the coming years in Wisconsin. There are very few states that are an exception to this. There's some states in the South that have a pretty fast growing population that are sort of staying stagnant or seeing a small amount of growth. But really, in the coming years, this is going to be sort of a national phenomenon. And we've looked at some projections. There's some projections that are even worse than that 4% number out there for Wisconsin that have come out in recent years or in recent months. So I think certainly right sizing and school districts is an inevitability. There's really no way to avoid it. I do think there are concerns that come up if full consolidation is sort of the only option on the table. And there's going to be some creativity in how this process happens. So, for example, we do have many rural districts around the country, right, where the next high school might be 30 or 40 miles away. We have that in this state as well. Consolidating to one high school, presents some unique challenges in that circumstance. So, there are other things to look at short of consolidation in some instances. That could be simply combining services so that you're sort of increasing the market size for like food services and things of that nature while maybe still maintaining two high schools. There's the options for more virtual education, which presents its own problems. But maybe you can have some supplemental classes in other districts without having to travel down there. So I think consolidation is an inevitability, but we have to have some nuance around the discussion. I think one area of research that's needed more is what are some creative solutions there, because I think it's, again, something in this country in the past we didn't have to deal with as we were sort of growing across the board. Obviously, that's no longer the case.
And so one of the things I think we're seeing driving that obviously is like declining birth rates, right? I think declining birth rates, people just rural areas are just not growing as much. I think we're going to see consolidation probably hit rural places first, like Madison, Waukesha, I think are growing, right? Probably. Flanders, you would know best, but like just so people, maybe outside of Wisconsin, like Waukesha is a massive suburb of the Milwaukee area, and Madison's obviously the state capital, and it's a kind of a thriving metropolitan from a population standpoint, but talk about Stephen's point. Talk about Green Bay. How will consolidation kind of hit them first?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's going to hit rural areas first. I will say, in our state, Madison is one of the few exceptions. There are very few districts that are actually seeing growth right now. But districts that are mid-sized, you mentioned Green Bay. Those districts do still have multiple elementary schools, multiple high schools. So there is room for school consolidation there. The real issue are the extremely rural districts with one high school, one elementary school, one middle school potentially that may be really far from their neighbors. So that's where some of the more creative solutions have to come into play potentially. Though consolidation may be an option if there happen to be two that are close to each other as well.
Rick, from a rural government standpoint, how could a state help kind of fit, like even just go about tackling this issue, right? Because like if you have a Madison dominated legislature, they may not really care at all about what's happening in a rural community per se with a school closing. Obviously, the economic impact would be insane losing a school like that. But so what is like the limited government approach from a policymaker standpoint?
You can imagine all sorts of things. I mean, obviously, the legislature can do what it wants to school districts. School districts are a creation of the state. They have no ability to stay as they are independent of the legislature. So the difficult question is what happens when you need some type of funding for transition, right? Because, as we suggested before, if your enrollment declines, you may have to do difficult things. You may have to close businesses, buildings. You may have to lay off teachers. You basically have to bring down your infrastructure. And there's pain involved with that, and pain can be ameliorated to some degree with money. I think the question is to what extent, particularly in with the polarization between urban and rural that we now see in Wisconsin, will that be forthcoming? It's legally possible. It can be done if it needs to be, but politically difficult.
I'll just add before we move on potentially there, when we think about consolidation, people often think about, I'm going to lose my high school, right? And, I went to high school here, I care about the football team, which is often the biggest concern of all.
And I just think there's a lot of jobs involved in that
This
too.
isn't Georgia, Will. It's not as big as when you grew up.
Well, we're talking to Texas here too, right? We're talking to Texas and Georgia, but essentially, one thing to note is that you can think about consolidation methods where you maintain multiple schools, right? Particularly for these rural districts, you can reduce the administrative burden by having one administration, but still maybe maintain multiple schools. In when we think about this, so when you're talking to people, this is obviously a very unpopular idea with many families as well. Emphasize that it doesn't necessarily mean the closure of your local school. There are ways to consolidate and maintain, more than one school building potentially and still save money.
I guess the key to survival will be, like you said, it's like, how do we keep the buildings open so that there are people and to keep the teachers obviously teaching, and then people don't have to drive their kids or bus their kids far, but then scaling back some of these kind of maybe administrative roles where the salary is obviously like as much as 1.5 or 2 times the teacher salary.
Absolutely. I think that's the key. And it's a lot of nuances. We don't have maybe we'd like to have the one key solution here, but there's a lot of different moving parts that have to be considered, in different situations, in every district around the country for sure.
You talked about virtual schooling. We are seeing parents opt for that. I think there's virtual schools all over, and they're not just rural areas. I think like Madison, Milwaukee. Like, talk about why people are now all of a sudden opting for a virtual school.
Yes, I think we saw, during the pandemic, obviously an increase in virtual, not only in, schools opting into virtual education, but schools that are dedicated to virtual education proliferating around the country. We do have a number of virtual schools in Wisconsin. I think we're for all options, whatever works best for every family. I think when you look at the data, frankly, the virtual schools tend to be sort of some of the lowest performing schools in the entire state, when you look at the data. But there are exceptions. There are virtual schools that are doing a good job. And part of that is what we call selection bias in social science. The families that are selecting into that more often than not, maybe families that are struggling or their students are struggling to begin with. So I think virtual education is a key component going forward. I think, maybe more in a supplemental role. If you want an AP class that's not offered in your school district, maybe you can take that virtually, for instance, rather than sort of going for that being the overall model of education. But as I said, we want a variety of options, and we want those virtual schools to be there for the kids and families that it works best for sure.
Because I think the pandemic gave virtual schooling like a terrible narrative around it, right? It was very it was seen as a problem. It went on too long. It didn't help kids. We saw the test scores obviously and all that too, a decline. But in some ways, it could very well be the future, especially as people just become more remote working, and the new kind of capabilities with artificial intelligence. And so, maybe there is a way to make it work. Maybe that is what we're going to see. And so I don't know if you guys agree with that or not.
I don't know. Wouldn't you think tool in the toolbox, but probably not something that most kids would want or that would be suited for most kids. But maybe for some. And the other thing, there's always this debate, and I think we'll refer to it as sort of disaggregating services. So, let's say, I'm a kid up in Anago and I want to learn Mandarin. I think that's really important. I wanted that to be the language that I study in high school, and Anago doesn't have a Mandarin teacher, but yet there should be some mechanism, to allow somebody up there maybe to, take a class virtually in addition to, the brick and mortar classes that she would otherwise attend.
To me, if I could sum up the state of education, which is kind of where we're kind of on the first part of this podcast, we're gonna go to solutions in a second. But like the biggest problem with education right now is we're spending more and more. We're kind of getting less and less when it comes to academic achievement. And then we have this overall horizon of declining enrollment and declining birth rates. And we're just going to see less kids going into school, enrolling in school, and maybe less kids will make it easier. But that's kind of the picture, right? That's unless I'm missing anything else, because I really want to dive into some solutions. But, we're kind of at a ticking time bomb here, right?
I think that's absolutely right. And, trends can change, right? The baby boom was a huge spike that maybe a lot of people didn't expect if you look at sort of population trends back in the 1940s and 50s. So you could probably see it coming with veterans coming home from World War II. But so that is the current track we're on, certainly. And it's things we ought to be thinking about how to solve.
Rick's nodding his head. I think he agrees with that too.
I grew up, Pat, in classrooms with 40 kids. You can't respond in real time to huge changes like that.
One of the things we like to talk about is on this, though, we don't just present a problem facing the country, but also some solutions that are making a difference. And so I think in education, what's nice about our system of government is we have 50 states, and states are doing different things. And I know Flanders has a ton of good research on this that he's been examining. Will, why don't you walk us through kind of some success stories when it comes to how people are tackling this, this crisis in our classrooms per se?
Yeah, so I think we've discussed already the school choice alternative, so we don't necessarily need to go too in depth on that. But I think it's important to keep that on the table. But I think what we're really seeing is that across the board, more customization of education is the pathway forward. So we have not seen this in Wisconsin as yet, but around the country we've seen states like Tennessee, like Arizona, like Texas implementing education savings accounts. And these are a method for, rather than sort of having a voucher where your kid can use that to attend a private school only. Again, it allows for more of that supplemental sort of thing. So maybe your kid gets a partial day of education at a private school, and then supplements that with some tutoring, supplements that with some sort of enrichment activities beyond what you could do with just a public school spend or with a voucher. I think one of the other intriguing things we saw during the pandemic, and it's continued since then, is this idea of micro schools. And this is as we talk about declining enrollment, this becomes maybe potentially more salient. But this is sort of a return to the one-room schoolhouse model in a lot of instances, where there may be a teacher who's disgruntled with the overall system and wants to sort of have more control of how they teach their classes than they can in the traditional public school system, and may have six or seven students in a class, but they're able to sort of tailor the curriculum their way to what works best for their students. So I think those are some of the key things. I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact, and it's something through Will's Restoring American Education project that we focus on a lot, is that there's always going to be a large share of parents that remain in the public school system. Even in Milwaukee, where we've had school choice for 40 years, about half of kids still remain in their zoned public school. So we can't ignore, the public school students either. We ought to be looking at solutions, there. Will, not me, but the organization, that's why we go by Flanders, has a lot of good policies out there to try to improve things for public schools, and everything from some of the social issues we face today to like the science of reading. So there's a lot of stuff there, but I think more customization is the wave of the future and the word going forward.
I want to talk about the Southern Surge because one, Flanders, tell us what that is. But then also what I like about it is I think it's something that we see happening in public schools, and it's a public school driven solution happening in a number of states across the country. And like we talked about, right? This is we have 50 different education systems in a lot of ways. So we're going to see stuff that works. We're going to see stuff that doesn't. I think Wisconsin can probably learn a lot. And I go ahead.
Yeah, so the Southern Surge, we were particularly focused on Mississippi, but also states like Louisiana. As we've seen test scores and the NAEP scores of the United States across the board declining post-COVID, there were a few exceptions, very few exceptions. And one of those was Mississippi, particularly in reading. Mississippi has seen their test scores go up, even though they have some of the most challenging populations in the country, maybe the most challenging in terms of poverty and in terms of sort of demographics. And what they were focused on, what the key to the solution there was that Mississippi has gone back to the basics in terms of reading instruction. They've implemented what's known as the science of reading. There's a lot of good resources out there that folks can look to learn about that. There's the Soul to Story series of podcasts that basically talks about how education sort of across the board has been subject to fads over the years, and nowhere have kids suffered more for that than with reading. We went away from what worked. We went away from phonics towards some of these newfangled methods that really didn't teach kids the basics. Mississippi went back on that trend, and they've actually surpassed Wisconsin in terms of fourth grade reading on the NAEP. Which is actually pretty incredible for people. I think I misspoke. I was actually testifying before the state legislator, and one of the legislators that can't be right. They've improved, but they haven't passed this, right? And I said, no, Senator. Mississippi had higher reading scores on the NAEP than Wisconsin. Not something you'd ever imagine in the past. So I think a back to the basics approach is what's working in the southern surge states. It's not necessarily more money. They spend less per student than we do here in Wisconsin, but they're seeing actually better results and dramatic improvement.
I would love people in Madison to hear that, kids in Wisconsin are doing worse than kids in Mississippi. I just think that would turn a lot of heads.
The irony of this is that years ago at Will, in the early years at Will, we did some research work for an organization that was trying to improve public education in Mississippi that was called, if I recall correctly, Out of Last Place. Which is where Mississippi was at the time. And so perhaps the work we did for them helped.
Well, there's always that joke. I lived in New Mexico for a while. I worked for the governor of New Mexico, and they had a phrase that said, "Thank God for Mississippi." I think West Virginia probably also says that. There's those states that are kind of towards the bottom, and they always say, "Thank God for Mississippi." But now, maybe Mississippi is saying, "Thank God for Wisconsin."
Growing up in Georgia, we were like 48th or 49th in education. So we heard that phrase a lot too. So you're absolutely right. And it's something that, people can't believe because we've grown up with this notion that there's just no hope for a state like Mississippi or West Virginia or some of these other states. But, the results are showing it's possible. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. And, going back to the basics, because so many states have gone away from it, because we've implemented all these fads in education, simply going back to the basics really surges a state towards the top. And that ought to be a lesson, for states like Wisconsin. We have passed, science of reading legislation here, we should note, but it's been a slow implementation process. The DPI, our Department of Public Instruction, has not really been a willing partner. So there have been challenges in getting it implemented. Hopefully we'll start seeing results going forward, but it's certainly been slower because we don't have sort of the enthusiasm and drive from the governor's office on down to make it happen.
I just want to stress too, like this is happening in public schools. This is happening with like taxpayer dollars. This isn't like Mississippi didn't just expand private schools to these astronomical amounts. It's not like this is all kids leaving a public school system. This is the public school system spending less money per kid than Wisconsin students and doing better.
Absolutely right. Yeah, they do have some school choice programs in Mississippi that are relatively new, but this is a public school story. And as we said, a lot of kids are always going to remain in public school, and there are many good public schools as well. But so this is a key point for public schools that we can show sort of pathway forward to improving outcomes for those students.
I think that's the beauty of the system, honestly. Like that's what we can replicate what's working elsewhere. Though I think we'll have a tough audience here in Wisconsin. I think the mindset here is very much like, we've been a leader in education for a long time. We've been, or honestly, I think the other thing is the left would say, well, ever since Act 10, that's when things really started to go wrong. And I guess maybe we can spend a little bit of time dispelling that narrative really quick. But, any of you guys can jump in on that.
Yes, I'll just say, Act 10, and for anyone from out of state, I'm actually surprised that, in the 15 years plus since then, some folks don't actually know what Act 10 was anymore. But Act 10 essentially was a public sector union reform. Among the key reforms was that it actually made, like the rest of us, teachers contribute to their retirement and their health care, and it moved us away from that requirement for a step and ladder pay system. So like Rick was talking about at the beginning, where we're sort of paying more on seniority than effort, it allowed districts to be more creative in their pay system, along with a lot of other things. But some say that has really hurt our teaching workforce here in Wisconsin, but the evidence really doesn't show that to be the case. What we've seen is sort of similar trends as what we've seen around the country. There are fewer people that want to be teachers, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. There's school discipline. There's sort of the lack of fulfillment sometimes in the job when you see when you see poor results and you're not really free to change things up. But yeah, there's really no evidence that Act 10 has had a differential effect on what we've seen in Wisconsin. Back a few years ago, we worked with Marty Loiken, who's now at Ed Choice, who was my predecessor in this job, did a pretty comprehensive study, and that was sort of borne out looking at years and years of data.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that people don't remember about Act 10 is that Wisconsin was facing a massive budget shortfall because federal funding that had been provided in the wake of the Great Recession was being withdrawn. And so the assumption was we're either going to have to raise taxes significantly or we're going to have to cut services significantly. And Act 10 was an effort to do neither of those things, but rather reduce the cost of providing the service. And, I don't deny the fact that there was pain involved in that. It was pain that was necessary, I think, because of the very difficult choices that the new Walker administration had to make. But if you look at, the numbers, I mean, the trend that we began the podcast with of, additional spending and flat results has more or less continued.
I want to tell a quick story, and I won't name the superintendent, but we talked to a superintendent of a public school just for some will-related work we were doing. And this individual I was asking him about Act 10. The camera wasn't rolling or anything. I was just trying to get his thoughts. And he said, I was an educator. My wife and I were educators. And when this first hit, we were devastated. We thought this was bad for us. And it really did affect our pocketbook in that moment. He was an educator, right? Now this individual is a superintendent. And he has said, he's like, I totally understand what we are trying to do with Act 10 and how it gives the administration some sort of tool to keep costs down or control costs, because you can't just let this stuff grow astronomically. And when I mean grow astronomically, I mean, retirement pension and insurance and all these things that teachers weren't contributing to. It just wasn't a sustainable system.
Yeah, we did some work relatively recently that if Act 10 went away, it would be about a $1.4 billion annual cost to school districts around the state, even more from the local governments beyond school districts. If you talk to even a lot of left-leaning superintendents off the record, they'll say that ending Act 10 would be devastating to our budgets, and we really couldn't survive or sustain an end to the benefits that this has provided.
Last question before we go to our closing segment on education, I want to stay to the topic of the episode. So we have a number of changes in technology and artificial intelligence, and kids can now use ChatGPT to write a paper. What does that mean for education going forward? What is like a conservative approach to policy to address some of these just like these landscape changes that are going to happen?
So it's the question of the day, right? It's the question of the era, really, in education. And I think we won't profess to have all the solutions, but I think that what we're seeing again with the one-to-one technology, particularly, the idea was that this will be important for kids to be able to be prepared for the jobs of the future. What I see more and more actually is that a lot of students even lack the most basic skills in Excel and Word and any of these sorts of services. So it doesn't seem like it's actually achieving that goal. So I think we've seen a lot of negative effects too. There's been a lot of negatives associated with the growth in technology, from more misbehavior in schools to students who no longer know how to sort of formulate their own ideas because they're just on the device the whole time rather than writing with pen and paper in the classroom. So I think obviously we can't ignore technology, and it is important that kids be prepared for the future. But I think that the main thing is to not make it the only goal of education, right? We ought to be teaching kids these skills to utilize AI in useful ways, to learn to work in programs that are important for the jobs of the future. But we still have a place for a pen and paper in the classroom. We still have a place for written essays that no kid really wants to do, but you gotta do it by hand theoretically. So getting that balance right, I think, is the key. And again, we don't have all the solutions, but I think that's sort of the guidepost that we ought to be looking to.
I'm super concerned right now, though, because of the fact that I don't think we've come close to hitting that balance, or even like thinking about it in the way that you just described. I think we are running into a huge problem where kids are going to leave school thinking even less than they do now. And I think that was this, Rick's probably, already thinking about the generation that he's on the Zoom with right now. I think it's going to be even worse. And so I don't know what you guys think about that.
It always gets worse, Pat.
But yeah, exactly. Any last thoughts before we go to our now favorite ending segment?
No, just adding to that. I mean, I think you're right that we're post pandemic, and there's been new research this year that shows kids coming into school are still starting further behind. So these are kids that didn't go through the pandemic closures, but there's been recent research that shows those kids are behind as well, and a lot of that is because they're spending their life on devices, right? They're not getting read to, they're not experiencing the world because they're tied to devices all the time. So this is an important thing, even beyond the COVID reductions in learning. Figuring out how to deal with technology, not only in schools, but also for families and their own relationship with their kids and technology. Absolutely something that's something we should be really focused on.
Yeah, there's a recognition, I think, that this is a problem. The difficulty might be, however, that it will further stratify kids because the families that are most likely to recognize that it's a problem and do something about it are probably, families with, two well-educated parents who, have the resources and the social capital to, you know, uh, keep their kids away from screens to some degree. And that's going to, further uh, amplify achievement gaps. That's one of the. I don't know what you do about that, but that's something that might happen.
Well, what do you do about it, Will?
Rick is absolutely right. It's not that these kids don't have access to devices that are in low income, groups. It's that their parents may be working two jobs, and the screen has to take more of a place of a, something for the kid to be occupied by. I didn't want to say for a parent, but they're taking the place of the parent more potentially in those situations. So it's definitely something to reconcile. I mean, I do think as we see these achievement gaps of kids coming into school. Many districts do focus on, giving supplemental services to kids that are behind in early grades. But I do think there's room when we talk about targeted spending and ways that maybe we could do things that are actually productive. Maybe that's an area that ought to be targeted even more, because I think you're right. Those gaps are only expanding, and we've seen that already in data that's out there.
Yeah, we were so worried about the digital divide that lower income kids wouldn't have access to these devices. Perhaps it's going to turn out that the problem is yes, there's a digital divide that's harmful, but it works the other way, right? Less access being better.
Moving to our final segment, which is, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, which I think is great for an education podcast episode. We ask our guests and we ask Rick, what is a lesson in history that we are basically doomed to repeat? And so we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question here. I think, keeping it education focused, I think we talked a little bit about how we moved away from the science of reading, towards all these other sorts of fads in education. And there's been new research this year that shows of all the major fields of social science, education policy results are the least replicable. So what works in one classroom, and we show this tremendous finding that teaching in this way leads to better outcomes for students, is not something that generally translates across the board. But I think what we see is that schools of education are subject to these fads. And it's inevitable that while we have seen a move in the last couple of years towards a return to the basics in many states, more of those fads will continue to come up, and schools of education will be taken in by them, and we'll go down some negative roads again in terms of things that don't actually work to improve student outcomes. So I think, unfortunately, it's a trend that's going to continue. It's history that we're probably somewhat doomed to repeat. But if folks out there can be more cognizant that maybe this is just a fad, maybe we should look for more data before we actually change our whole curriculum to fit this fad. Maybe that can sort of stem it and reduce the negative implications to some extent.
Very on brand. Well done.
Well, I want to return to that 16-year-old left-leaning high school student that I once was. At about that time, it will surprise nobody to know that I was on the debate team in my high school. I was actually pretty good. The topic one year was whether there should be an increased federal role in education. And so there were all sorts of plans that were put out there. A lot of them revolved around somehow spending more money on schools. And I was surprised to learn, because, you're a high school debater, you go out and you do a lot of research. I was surprised to learn that there was an increasing back then, and we're talking early 70s, there was an increasing body of evidence that more money above a certain minimum threshold didn't really improve educational outcomes. And I thought that was really, really counterintuitive. I didn't, would not have expected that. And that finding has been replicated, if you will, again and again and again over the past 60 years. I mean, it is robust in a way that most social science findings are not. And, people from time to time come up with exceptions. Maybe we could do this, maybe we could do better. We'll identify that perhaps some targeted spending will help. But this is a lesson that our experience has taught us again and again and again and again, but yet we refuse to learn from it. And I'm not sure I see that changing.
And we talked about non-replicable findings. That's one finding that is replicable. And when we see it in our state, the relationship between spending and outcomes is actually in the opposite direction. It's a little bit negative. So that one is replicable for sure.
An excellent episode on education and really how important it is that we kind of fix the problems in the classroom so that we can really address some of the issues facing the country. So thanks again for a great episode, everyone. As you know, you can find this podcast really wherever you get your podcast, or will-law.org/podcast as well. It just has all the links to all the different places you can find us. So we appreciate it. And thanks again for a great episode, everyone.